Welcome to the Damcasters, brought to you in association with the Pima Air and Space Museum. I'm your host, Matt Bone. Hello everybody and welcome to part 2 of our look into the early life of Air Vice Marshal Don Bennett. And of course, we're joined by Ian Campbell once again, who is the author of Relentless Skies and the curator of the Bennett Vial Archive at the Queensland Air Museum. And as you saw in part 1, Ian is great. And this week, we get into the really exciting stuff with Don and Imperial Airways. And I'm delighted to say we spent a lot of time talking about the frankly bonkers Mayo Composite aircraft. That was a modified S-23 Empire flying boat with a 4-engine float plane strapped to the top of it. And Don set some incredible records in that. So this conversation really wraps up what is in Relentless Skies. And I have to say, and I'm probably saving this for this episode, this is my aviation book of 2024. So I can't recommend it highly enough. And it was great to chat to Ian about this fascinating period in Don's life. Of course, I have to say thank you to our fabulous sponsors at the Pima Air and Space Museum out in sunny Tucson, Arizona, where it's probably a lot warmer and less drizzly than it is here in Sussex. So many thanks to them for their continued support. And of course, if you want to help us to choose what's going to happen with the 100th episode, join us on Patreon from just £3 a month, become a Damcastier. More about that at the end of the show. But without further ado, let's get into this and continue our conversation with Ian Campbell about Don Bennett before he became Air Vice Marshal Don Bennett. The other thing that you mentioned as well is at this time as well, he's also trying to get into the McPherson Trophy Air Race, the London to Melbourne race in 1934, which for some reason I had no clue that to be fair, he didn't get very far in it, but getting involved in that as a serving officer, also flying for, was it
Jersey Airways?
Jersey Airways as well. He was moonlighting all over the place at the same time as being a sort of senior instructor on flying boats for the RAF. He was sort of spreading himself thin.
Yeah, the Centenary Air Race gets a complete chapter in the book because there is new information that has come out about that. October 1934, he spent some time having got his first class navigator's license, which enabled him to enter the race. He cast around for some time looking for an aircraft. He was originally going to fly it with Henry Beard, but they didn't manage to get a plane. All sorts of things were happening during that year, and eventually it was a Scotsman who was actually flying in Civil Airways in Australia, Jimmy Woods, who took him on board as a navigator, flying the Lockheed Vega DL-1A, which is a one-off aircraft. It's probably we probably won't talk through the race here, except to say that he was never quite clear as to why he actually participated in the race. And I sort of speculate that perhaps it was the first great test for his first class air navigator's license. It was flying from Mildenhall in England to Melbourne in Australia. So there was that destination element of it. Also, he had his heroes by this stage, the Bert Hinklers and the Kingsford Smiths and others and the Amy Johnsons, and the whole idea that he might fly himself from England to Australia, I think, was a great attractant for him. But there's some fascinating detail in how that whole thing came together, how he and Jimmy Woods were so totally different personalities, chalk and cheese when it came to planning. It's actually amusing. If it wasn't so serious, it would actually be amusing. And it has its comeuppance in Aleppo in Syria, but it's just a wonderful story in its own right.
At the same sort of time as this, he meets someone who helps him channel and
Mm.
fit perfectly into, I guess, the very type A personality that he was. And it's a young Swiss governess, isn't it? Which is, yeah, if you were writing this as a screenplay, that would almost be a little bit trite, wouldn't it? But Lai certainly fits into this story perfectly for Don, doesn't she?
Yeah, Elsa Gubler, known as Lee.
Lee, sorry.
Yes, Lee. No,
Hmm.
that's fine. Lee. She is, in fact, has arrived in England to learn English and be the au pair for Group Captain William Calloway, who is the base commander at Calshot. And she's invited to play the role of a French girl in a play on the base. And it's there when a young flying officer lays eyes on her and she lays eyes on him, and the smile across the crowded room, and they're gone for all money. And uh, he sort of tries to explain that it all happened a bit of like he was teaching her English and it went from there and whatever. But it turns out that she was inquiring through Calloway about him and he was inquiring through Calloway about her. And the end result is that she and he, uh, betrothed, get married in the August of 35. And I think the amazing thing about her is that she just takes him for who he is. She herself is incredibly intelligent, incredibly capable, independent minded. Um, she's multilingual. Uh, and that they are soulmates. They are really incredible soulmates. Um, and she doesn't try to change him in any way. She just allows him to be himself. And so she then becomes his great confidant. And this happens all the way through their life. There's some wonderful photos of them at the end of his life. They clearly loved each other's presence. And I say in the book that in batting parlance, when Don got Lee, he was batting well above his average. Now, one of the interesting things about their great differences was that she was a great extrovert and he was a great introvert. And my view is, and there'll be much more exploring of this, and I may end up changing my mind, but from what I know already, I won't, is that as the great introvert, he hated social occasions. They were just not his thing. He would much rather be doing something sensible, goal focused, and task focused in his office somewhere. Um, she was much more able to get around and be happy in people's presence, etc. And I do love this idea I have in my mind of them arriving at various parties where he can just sort of be a bit of a wallflower and have conversations with the people who really matter. And she can glide through the room and she fulfills, in that regard, a wonderful function for him in allowing him just to be himself.
It they do seem that perfect match, don't they? They whatever you read about them in the relationship, and especially the way you frame it in your work as well, is they just seem lovely. As someone who I feel that my wife is fantastic for me, as I'm sure yours is for you. But when it's found, it's a magical thing. Granted, around about the same sort of time, his marriage with the RAF comes to a slightly less amicable conclusion, because he's had his eyes turned by Imperial Airways, hasn't he?
Well, he's actually decided at uh, his short service commission of 4 years is up in August 35. And he's already making noises about leaving. As you said, he had so he'd gone moonlighting at Jersey Airways. Um, he had got his first class air navigator's license in 34. He had participated in the Centenary Air Race. He had been thinking for about 18 months, what would he do in August 35? And he had concluded that the Air Force was not progressing at a rate that would satisfy his need to be moving with where aviation was going. And he perceived that civil aviation was innovating faster. And so he was signalling very strongly that to Gil Say, who was his flight commander at Calshot, that he really wanted to be moving on, and Gilsay was giving him sufficient freedom to actually go and explore that. So by August 35, he's looking for a new job. He's casting around, and it's one of the things that I'm exploring for Volume 2 is the degree to which Harris actually had an impact on that, because Harris actually claims that he got him the job at Imperial Airways. We won't go into that now. Um, uh, is there a clash of egos going on here, or is there something else? But he is looking around, and he actually considered, after they got married and came back to Australia, he was considering coming back to Australia, and he actually had an interview for a job at New England Airways. But they were not in flying boats, they were not doing international routes, and they weren't paying as much. But he had in his pocket this job offer from Imperial Airways beginning in 36, and he was aware that the Empire flying boats were coming shortly, and this offered brand new opportunities to him. So in January 36, they're back in England, and he commences as a first officer at Imperial Airways. I need to note, though, you mentioned flight lieutenant before, he actually left the RAF as a flying officer, which is an
Okay.
extraordinary thing when he's coming back into the Air Force, is that he's coming back in as a wing commander.
Fun way to jump a few ranks on your return, but because
It caused a few conniptions around the place. Mm-hmm.
Flora was saying you got that fun bit in the book about the letters complaining about what pay he should be on, which is always telling of someone when they're trying to figure out that within the RAF bureaucracy.
Yeah. Yes, it's a wonderful to have that paperwork. The fact that he kept that paperwork is something indicative of him as well. That one of the I don't know, it's a running gag. I guess it's just part of the story. Is his distaste for bureaucracy, of which the RAF has quite a bit, and that again is part of the issue with why he's wants to move out to Imperial Airways, and that at Imperial Airways, the air superintendent Brackley, Major Brackley, is very much of the view that the captains of the aircraft have the first and final decision.
Mm.
Now, they have a full rule book, obviously, a copy of which we have. I've got Bennett's copy in the Queensland archive, in his archive. There's an awful lot of rules they have to follow, but ultimately the freedom is extended to the captain of the aircraft to make decisions. And this he loves. He embraces this. And this again becomes that part of where he starts to want to set records, is because he is given that initial freedom, which he didn't have at the RAF.
Because that introduction of the C-class Empire boats, we had Phil Valbray on about 18 months ago now, and we did 2 whole episodes on the aircraft. Phil from the Airways Museum down in Melbourne, and a lot of fun, fascinating aircraft, and it certainly that idea of it, the more maritime approach that Imperial were taking with their aircraft, as they'd be flying long distances on their own. The buck stopped with the captain in a very maritime sense, wasn't it? That was something that must have completely appealed to him, chasing the captaincy at Imperial.
Absolutely. And in fact, the Imperial strategy was in fact to reach the Empire, the parts of the Empire, faster and more frequently through the strategy of the flying boats, which is why the S-23s and the S-30s were so important, was because this was the way that they would actually expand the empire. There were much more ready-made runways on water at this stage than there were for land-based planes. And so to get to Australia would be 40 days by sea, by ship, whereas they could do it in 9-10 days and more frequently in the flying boats, which was the great attraction. As I write, as we get to the start of the war, when the Germans are bringing out the Focke-Wulf Condor, is they were starting to prove the value of the land-based planes, and ultimately that would render the flying boats redundant. But at this stage, from 36 through to 1940, this is the golden age of the flying boats and the extraordinary service that they offered. And As I write at one stage, the view of the passengers was that the captains of these flying boats were like gods.
Yeah, it's a period of time that just fascinates me. I got to stay on Lake Naivasha in Kenya at the old flying boat station, which is now a lovely hotel, the Lake Naivasha Country Club. Check it out, Google it, dear listener. But you sort of walk out to the old jetty, and as the sun's setting, your sort of mind can wander, and you just think, what would it have been like to see those huge things fly in and out, and very, very sort of crumpled people piling out to be met with
That's right.
trays of champagne and pims and things to get them going.
Yeah, yeah.
But,
Oh, yes, and there was only one class which was first.
mm,
So this whole idea of that you would along the promenade deck and look out the large windows before you headed to the smoking room to have your smoke, and the actually something that I wanted to read to you was the great hub for Imperial was at Alexandria. So they would have the Mediterranean route to England, and then they would fly east through to Southeast Asia and down through to Australasia, and then they would have south down the Nile and down through to Kenya, and then over to the east coast and then down. And one of the things that I really loved, and just reading from the book here, is when flying this route over coming months, Don records them taking the opportunity to give passengers their money's worth by flying low over herds of elephants and giraffes, hippos below the Murchison Falls, and rhinoceros. On the Kisumu Mombasa leg, a slight deviation in course took them past Mount Kilimanjaro. Turning passengers into incidental air tourists was a common occurrence at Imperial because of its marketing value. Over the Mediterranean, passengers could see the remains of the Greek, Roman, and Egyptian empires. Down through Africa, they were enthralled by pre- and post-colonial sites, vast and spectacular natural landscapes, and, as Don highlighted, an exotic array of animals. Making herds stampede for passenger enjoyment occurred. Quote, the pages of one air travel narrative teem with giraffe, elephant, rhino, lion, eland, hartebeest, gazelle, hyena, and warthog. Spotting wildlife had never been as easy or as fruitful. The in-air sightseeing was matched by the many stopovers punctuating the journey. In Africa, these ranged from Shepherd's Hotel and the Continental Savoy in Cairo, frequented earlier by the likes of General Gordon and Lawrence of Arabia, through to less salubrial colonial outposts. There might be time to visit local sites and experience something of local culture in places that would never have been visited otherwise. I mean, just this is boys' own stuff. It's absolutely glorious. I just loved it.
oh,
Yeah.
I, I adore that whole period of
Mm.
Imperial Airways flying. So, we must crack it. We can go on about that bit for a while, but we have to talk about Mercury because this is where I suppose Don within aviation circles is making a name for himself. But the next big leap where I guess he bursts into the public's consciousness is with the fascinating Mayo composite aircraft with which is essentially a was it an S30 with the Mercury on the top of it and
Modified
mm,
S-23.
23,
So,
beg your pardon, yeah.
so yeah. So the I
I should
remember.
say before we get into this,
Mm.
why? That's because you look at it, it's ridiculous. So I suppose the sensible question to
Yeah,
start with is why.
yeah, yeah. It's very interesting you should say that because when my wife first looked at a photo of the Mayo composite, she said, "That's nuts." And it's a perfect summary. Is it's nuts. The only thing that we've seen like it is the space shuttle, really.
Mm,
But it was actually a design that Robert Mayo, who worked at Imperial, their chief designer, came up with for the purpose of flying the Atlantic. Now, remembering that in the early 30s, predominantly by air, was not an issue of passengers but freight or mail. And so what he was designing was an aircraft that could actually fly the Atlantic for the purposes of carrying freight or mail. And the idea was to take a seaplane, which is Mercury, 4 engines, and stick it on top of an S-23. So it was called Maya. What they had to do is they had to widen the hull considerably, increase the wingspan, and move the engines further out in order to be able to perch Mercury on top of it. And it would be attached by 6 ball spigots, as Don called them. And then the idea would be Maya would take the greater amount of the load in getting off the ground. And then at a point where the Mercury engines were carrying the greater portion of the load, they would actually then decouple. And it would be at a time where they could be sure that Mercury would ascend and Maya would descend at a sufficient rate that they wouldn't run into each other. I mean, it is totally bonkers. Now, the reason for this was that by itself, Mercury would not be able to fly the distance. So you would get off the ground and then you would decouple, and then Mercury would have sufficient fuel. And the plan in still air, with a full fuel load, once decoupled, Mercury could fly from Foynes, which is on the west coast of Ireland, all the way to New York. At least that was the plan. But ultimately, the idea was that they would use it for freight as a freight mail option on different routes as required. Of course, it had fatal flaws to start off with, and that is that for Mercury to be able to operate at its greatest range, you needed a Maya in every port, and you needed a crane at every port to get Mercury on top of Maya. So to fly west all in one go was well and good, but once you're in the Americas, Mercury is in the Americas, to get back, you would have to fly to the Azores and then to Lisbon and then back up to England. But that was not the issue for Don. For Don, this was a preeminent challenge. And to get the job, which he did, that would be his aircraft and his aircraft alone. He didn't have to share this with anybody else. And he didn't want to be the pilot for Maya because that would just be simply getting Mercury off the ground. He wanted to be in Mercury because Mercury offered the opportunity of going and doing things that had not been done before.
And yeah, you can see the appeal. Well, you can see the appeal of the challenge. I've got a picture of it up here, and I'm just going, no thanks, because your wife is correct. It's nuts, but
it's nuts.
It needed somebody like Don with that technical outlook, master navigator, and singular ambition to be able to make it work. Because that first flight across the Atlantic was pretty hairy, wasn't it? They got as far as Montreal, I think it was, wasn't it?
Oh, it was. They had determined they had fitted out S-23s with larger fuel tanks. The Atlantic was the great challenge because of the vast expanse of water, 1,900 miles. It was the vast expanse. So it was the golden prize to actually do the Atlantic. And they'd done the S-23s and they determined that it was possible provided you had enough fuel. So they had sufficient information to be contemplating this. But it was decided that the first commercial flight would be by Mercury out of Foynes on 21st of July 1938. Now, the issues was that they had Arthur Wilcoxon, who was actually his boss of the North Atlantic division at Imperial. He was going to fly Maya. Don was going to fly Mercury, but they had very, very precious experience. They'd only separated twice prior to this. Mercury itself was having some vibration problems with its engines, and going to this issue of risk, where Don would assess the risk of various things and plan accordingly. This seemed to be a reasonably risky venture. Once they got once they actually got a loft for this record flight, immediately there were problems. So they ran into a storm after about 90 minutes, which lasted for a fair bit of the flight. The fuel gauge didn't work for the first 6 hours of the trip. Now, Don was quite skilled in calculating. He'd done quite a lot of work in calculating fuel consumption, but it can be a little unnerving, I would think, if you're on a record-breaking flight across 1,900 miles of ocean, not in a flying boat, but in a seaplane. He discovered there was lateral instability with the fuel tank in the wing, and the autopilot wasn't coping with that. And then they discovered, once they hit the storm, which was only 90 minutes in, that the cabin windows were not watertight. So everything got wet. The charts, the log sheets, everything got wet. And they didn't turn around and come back. They just kept going. So they finally, as they were going to land at Botwood in Newfoundland, but he arrived there with more fuel than he thought. So he takes the decision that he's going to fly straight over Botwood and he's going to head for Boucherville in Montreal. And so when he finally lands in Montreal, they've created 3 world records. That was the first commercial payload across the Atlantic. It was the first non-stop east to west flight from the UK to Montreal, and it was the fastest east to west Atlantic crossing as measured from Foynes to Cape Bald, which was achieved in 13 hours and 29 minutes of very bad weather and wetness both inside and outside the cabin.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like it was a nice flight at all, was it? The way you describe it, just the conditions on board were just terrible. Absolutely
it
terrible.
wasn't good. It wasn't good. And he was actually a bit grumpy when he arrived. The press had been following this on both sides of the Atlantic for months. And so when he actually lands in Boucherville, everybody wants a piece of him. But his ultimate destination is New York. And so as he writes in his memoirs, all these people that the press is all trying to get in and the rest of it, he clears everybody out because he wants to get refueled, fill out the forms, get it done, and just fly straight south down to New York to Port Washington. So he didn't. He didn't create a terribly good impression in Montreal, but by the time he had arrived at Port Washington, he was actually ready to embrace it. And there is a wonderful photo of him standing there. We're surrounded by all the press, and there's all the clicking of the cameras and the rest of it, and he embraces it. And of course, it was front page news at the New York Times, and it was a very big deal.
Yeah, I'm sure he hated being on the front page of the New York Times.
but it was nothing compared with the seaplane record flight from Dundee to South Africa, which was an absolute doozy.
Yeah, because that's the next record attempt. Because you said earlier that all of the different ideas that he had, and of course this was just after the Russians had made their big flight from over the top down to Mexico. So he was going after that record, wasn't he?
Well, the Germans had actually done a Dornier DO-18. It actually launched off a ramp on a ship just south of England there in the Channel somewhere, and it actually flown to South America. But it wasn't endorsed by the Federation.
No record counts unless the French agree about it.
Yes, the Federation of Aeronautical whatevers that is responsible for keeping the records and ensuring that whoever attempted a record, it was in accordance with the instructions that were laid down. So it was determined after the success of the flight across the North Atlantic that they would attempt. Originally, Don's idea was to attempt the seaplane record, the straight line seaplane record. And he was proposing to fly from Southampton and just head south. But it was put to him, and it may have been by Mayo, I can't recall, that he should attempt the absolute distance record. And so they chose Dundee, off the River Tay in Dundee, and they would fly through to Cape Town. And coming up to October 1938, and they had this planned they would actually put extra fuel into the floats. They installed electric pumps to pump that up into the wing tank, and they would then lift off from the River Tay and just keep flying directly south, ultimately hitting Cape Town. Now, it struck problems as soon as they got into the air, which was that a cowling broke off. And he wasn't aware immediately as to what the problem was, but what he was finding was that his fuel consumption was increasing at a much greater rate than he had anticipated. And when he discovered what the problem was, he contemplated returning, but that would mean flying around and around to use up the fuel. It had also come just after the Munich Agreement, and they were concerned at Imperial that they might not have another shot at this. He also felt that if he could get the whole fuel mix under control, they could actually make a good go of it. And so they continued on down. The thing to keep in mind here is we're talking about a seaplane, and the only time this seaplane is going to pass over water is over the English Channel and then over the Western Med, but for almost the entire flight, it's going to be over land. So it's extremely important that this aircraft stays in the air. So he's already taking a risk by going, okay, well, let's continue on and let's see how we go. Now, he was sending back reports. One of the great things to discover in the archives is the actual report notation that he sent back, which gave me a very clear picture of how the flight unfolded. So they were proceeding, but he was immediately starting to make calculations that perhaps the absolute distance record was not within frame, but he could still look at the seaplane distance record. They did pretty well over the Sahara until they hit sub-Saharan Africa. Two things were a problem. The electric pumps failed. Both electric pumps failed. All they had to make up for that was a wobble pump. So they took turns on the wobble pump, pumping an estimated 1,400 gallons up into the wing tank so that the plane could stay in the air. And then on the afternoon of the second day, we'll get to how long it took shortly, they hit sub-Saharan Africa, equatorial area, and the plane is bucking around. Now, it wasn't a threat to Mercury itself, but you can imagine being on a wobble pump and the plane is going all over the place. And this caused all sorts of trouble. And so he was actually fearing that they would not be able to pump sufficient fuel into the tank to get through the night. It didn't help that Ian Harvey, who was his co-pilot, started hallucinating. So he was not only extremely tired, but perhaps a few fumes, etc. He was struggling to the nth degree, leaving a greater burden to Don to be able to keep this plane in the air. Autopilot was working, and he was parking Ian Harvey there just to monitor in the cockpit to make sure things, they didn't drop out of the sky. Anyway, they let's just say they made it through the night, and in the end made it not quite to Cape Town, but still broke the record. But the extraordinary thing to me, being a modern flyer, 42 hours and 26 minutes with problems, non-stop.
Yeah, I that doesn't appeal. I've done the London to Perth direct flight. That wasn't nice, and that was
17 hours.
17 and a bit, and that was with a lovely stewardess bringing me gin.
Yeah, in a pressurized cabin,
in a pressurized cabin.
You weren't. Let me guess, you weren't pumping your own fuel either.
No, I wasn't. I was watching Star Trek, so it was. So it's a little bit more comfy, yeah. But yeah, that's just when we talk distances, sometimes we forget how long it would take, and 12 hours to get across the Atlantic when if our flight takes over 8, we're a little bit cranky. It's in completely different things. I loved the codes that they were using as well to pass on how they were getting on and things. That was
a wonderful discovery. Was the pluses and the minuses of having a very efficient and simple code to send, but then you would send a code And you can imagine back at base, they were going, "Oh my goodness, what's wrong now? Are they still in the air?" You know, that sort of. And I think the other thing is not just the physical problems that they encountered on that flight and the tiredness but the intestinal fortitude to keep going.
Mm.
Even at that last, where he was considering flying over uh, Orange River, which is ultimately where they landed, to go heading further south towards Cape Town to get to Port Nolloth. And it's something that we have in the collection. We have 700 plus of Don Bennett's maps.
Wow.
So I have in the collection all the maps for that flight, the actual maps. And so when it goes, he's considering Port Nolloth, I'm looking at this map, and it's an old Admiralty map from the 1870s or something. And this is one thing that's not appreciated about this period of aviation, especially if you're working to break boundaries across new horizons, etc., is that you're working with very primitive maps. If you're not out over the ocean with no land to look at and just relying upon your own calculations and celestial navigation, your terrestrial navigation is in some parts of Africa is not going to be that much better because the maps are just ancient. And so you look at this map from of Port Nolloth, and you go, well, he's looking at this on the flight, and he's going, no, can't land there. Better land at Orange River.
That always reminds me of the Blackadder gag when they're like, here's the map to where you're going. Fill it in as you go. Yeah.
There's something. It's something. This intestinal fortitude. But where does this whole risk thing again? Where does it cross over into a form of madness, or where does self-confidence actually catch up with reality? This reaching the horizons, reaching the boundaries, crossing the boundaries, this is the thing that motivates him and drives him forward. And yet he is so risk aware, so conscious of that risk and how to balance it. This is one of the great things about the Bennett story, is his relationship with risk.
I've just seen how long we've been chatting, and I think what we're going to do is we're going to tease the start of the war, because the story of the Tirpitz raid is fantastic. But dear listener, I would highly recommend all the stuff we've talked about. But what Don did to help set up the transatlantic ferry service is extraordinary. For, again, as we've been discussing with Mercury, the amount of work, dedication, the risk reward analysis to be able to enable what became such a huge operation a few months after they did that first flight with the Hudsons. It was, what did you find in Don's notes and things from that period? We won't explain too much about what it is. Dear listener, go buy the book. That's why we're here, of course. But when you were looking at that period in there, did you see similar parallels to, say, the Mercury flights and things like that, where he was doing that analysis to see what the art of the possible was?
Yes, and I think that the driver, one of the key drivers for him, having flown the Atlantic, and he had done it both in Mercury and in the S-30s, which were the upgraded Empires, the general consensus in the Air Ministry and the RAF was that flying American aircraft across the North Atlantic could not be done. But it needed to be done because a lot of the aircraft were getting put on board ship and sunk by U-boats. And Beaverbrook heard that it could be done. Don was one of a number of people involved in setting up Atlantic Ferry, but it was he who went into Beaverbrook's office, and Beaverbrook asked him, can it be done? And he said, well, I've assessed it. It comes down to two things: range and icing. And if we can deal with range and icing, we can get these aircraft across the North Atlantic. Bearing in mind, coming that this is August 1940, a desperate need for aircraft, but we're also heading towards winter. Now, flying the North Atlantic is not fun at any time, but flying in winter was considered to be the chief stopper to this particular enterprise. But he was going to prove them wrong. And he tackles everything. He tackles the whole issue of the aircraft, the selection, the range issues, the icing issues, the recruitment and training of the crews, the uh, he works with Joe Gilmore on all the engineering issues once they've got them to Montreal, and he's working on the meteorology issues as well with the chief meteorologist. And he puts plans together. As I write in the book at one stage, he was putting plans together for that very first formation flight for each individual aircraft, where the cruising calculations were done in fractions of horsepower.
Which is extraordinary because he'd been out to Lockheed, hadn't he? He'd tested the aircraft. He'd done the notes on them as well. It, the amount of work, the amount of detail that he put in to be able to prove that out.
This is the classic illustration of where he perceived when the risk was highest, the level of micromanagement was highest.
Mm.
He had his fingers in everything. And I think that that's the story, is not just his capacity for being across all the issues that I just talked about, but that if the fact that he could drill into the detail on all of those and then lead the crews, train the crews, and lead the crews on that first flight as a demonstration that it could be done. He wasn't going to organize this for other people to do. He was going to demonstrate his belief by leading that very first formation flight of Lockheed Hudson's. Extraordinary thing.
Mm.
Don't forget the story of rescuing Sikorsky. Taking Sikorsky to rescue his general staff the day before the French surrendered.
Mm-hmm.
Amazing story in itself. His
Yeah.
leading of the 10 Squadron out for bombing the Tirpitz.
Yep. We buy the book, people. Come on, that's what we want, so that we can get Ian to hurry up with the second volume because I want to read it.
Don't
I
be like
think.
that.
I think my favorite part of the Tirpitz story is the telegram he's able to send to his wife, that to let her know that he's okay after he does many shenanigans in Sweden to make sure that he can send that. I I read that part to my wife and she thought that was
Yeah.
brilliant. Yeah.
Yes, that anecdote that comes from David Gray at the University of Dalarna of the lady Constance Mallison writing about Don Bennett in a letter to Bertrand Russell. It's just the most exquisite characterization of Don Bennett. It's just brilliant. No better summary of the man. But that he was, while uh, awaiting repatriation back to England at the Fulham internment camp, is going out to buy a set of silk stockings for Lee. It's just a gem, and speaks to their relationship as well.
And again, a man taking advantage of every opportunity that's being put in front of him. Yeah, I
Yeah,
can go shopping. You're coming over in the spring, aren't you, to the International Bomber Command Center? Aren't you? You're doing a talk
that's
there, aren't
right.
you?
Yeah, my wife and I are actually going to spend 3 months in the UK from mid-April to mid-July, and the Bomber Command Centre has been wonderful. On the arrangement of my publisher Ian Hooper at
Mm.
Lescheneau Press, it's organised for me to speak on the 1st of May at the International Bomber Command Centre, and I'm very, very grateful for that opportunity. I'm actually going to be speaking on something which starts in volume one, but also heads into volume two, which was brought into the question of what exactly did Arthur Harris know about Don Bennett in appointing him to command the Pathfinder Force in 1942. And it picks up a little bit from the very final paragraph of volume one, which is that very meeting where Arthur Harris calls him in and appoints him to command. And I'm just intrigued by that question as to what convinced him that Don was really the only person who could do the job that he had in mind for him.
Yeah, because there's all the conjecture things that he was bowling him a googly, wasn't he? Because he didn't want the Pathfinders, but he gave it to someone who would make it work. I'm fascinated to hear what you're gonna find. But that's May 2025, isn't it? Up at Lincoln.
1st of May, yes, and they have it. The IBCC has it on their website now. If you want to register, I've got a couple of speaking engagements later as well, including the RAF Club in London on the 22nd. I think it's the 22nd of May. What's firmed up at this stage, anyway, is the 1 May at Lincoln.
Well, we'll make sure we share all of those, and of course, when you're over, we shall have to meet up and do a dinner. I'll probably sneak along to the RAF Club. I never miss an opportunity to pop into the RAF Club. Ian, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for the book and for sending it over to me early. It is fantastic, and I'm not just saying that because you're here. I devoured it. I thought it was a fascinating read and incredibly well written. So thank you so much for that, and thank you for getting up early for me.
Well, thank you for the opportunity, and thanks for staying up late.
That's all right. I'm lubricated, so
I've really appreciated this, and it's just been a great conversation.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
I cannot thank Ian Campbell enough for joining us here on the Damcasters. These last 2 episodes I've thoroughly enjoyed, and the conversation with Ian about Don was I really enjoyed it, and I really hope you've enjoyed this 2-parter as well. The book, which I'm going to keep plugging, because like I said in the intro, is my aviation book of the year, is Relentless Skies by Ian Campbell, subtitled Volume 1, The Most Efficient Airman, 1910 to 1942. It's out now from all good and evil bookstores. Get yourself a copy. It is well worth your time. And it's that time of year. Buy it for presents for other people as well. I've adored it, and really, really, I can't say enough about it. I'm going to stop going on about praising it because we're looking ahead to our 100th episode, which will be coming up in February. If you become a Damcaster from just £3 a month plus a bit of that over on Patreon, I'm going to be throwing some ideas around. We've had some suggestions come in as well. We'll see what we can do, and we'll get it together, and you guys will all know about what's going to be happening there. I have a plan, actually, which I did bounce off everybody today, which is Monday when we're recording this. So, yeah, it might be a thing. So join us over there, and it'll be great. You also get your name in the credits at the end. You'll see the credit roll at the bit at the end of the pod. You can have your name in that as well. Stickers, magnets to go on your fridges, bookmarks. I think I've got some bookmarks talking around. Here's one of the older ones. There you go. Check that out. All from just £3 a month or a bit more if you're feeling generous. But this is going to be the last episode for 2024. I'm going to drop in maybe 1 or 2 little videos I've been playing around with between now and then, because when we kick January off, we're doing a month, about 3 or 4 episodes, all filmed at the fantastic Wings Over the Rockies Museum in Denver. I was there in November, and what a fantastic place. So Stu, the head curator, is going to be joining us. We're going to be looking at the B-1A they have there and our Missing Century Series fighter. Go check out the Century Series video for that one. That's going to be January. And of course, February, we're going to be hitting episode 100. And what we're going to do for that, you can find out. There might be a bit of a gap where we sort that out. But anyways, thank you so much for your support this year. 2024 has been the best year for the channel so far. So thank you so much for liking and subscribing and doing all that fantastic stuff. I really hope you have a great next few weeks, whatever you do. And thank you for your support and for tuning in. It's really humbling. So thank you for that. And until 2025, which sounds terribly science fiction-y, thank you. And keep an eye on the channel. Like I said, I'm trying to get this rockets thing I'm doing. So it's like a history of the RP3. That's going in typhoons, rockets, all good stuff. And we're playing with some other bits and pieces too. So thank you. Until next time. Oh, always end this up, but it is that time of year. Check in with your friends. It's tough times. So just make sure you're around for everybody. And if you are needing a bit of help as well, reach out, because nobody wants to lose anybody ever, especially at this time of year. So do take care of yourselves. Thank you for your continued support of the channel and the pod. Follow us on Blue Sky, where we're doing all the aviation stuff as well. Links in the description below. Check out Pima, buy Ian's book. Here we go. Relentless Skies. I think the one that's out is actually a nice hardcover one. This is an advanced copy, which is buy the book. It's great. See you later. Bye-bye. I just want to say many thanks to our fabulous Damcasteers on Patreon. If you head over to our Patreon page, you can join the crew and get your name in the credits from just £3 a month plus a bit of that. The Damcasters is hosted and produced by Matt Bone and is a Boney Abroad podcast production.